She's 130 pounds soaking wet. What is Warcom thinking? Cole Maddox's voice cut across the entire yard like a blade. He grabbed the briefing sheet, held it up in front of his platoon, and tore it in half. Slowly, deliberately. So every man could see exactly what he thought of the orders. A Marine girl, 24. They want her inside our training program. He dropped the torn paper on the ground. Over my dead body. The laughter that erupted was brutal, unanimous, and absolute. Not one of them heard the gate open behind them. If you've ever watched someone destroy their own credibility before they even knew what hit them, stay with this story. Subscribe, follow every part to the end, and drop a comment with your city. I want to see how far this reaches. The morning started in the way most mornings at Naval Base Coronado started, with salt air, sweat, and the kind of institutional arrogance that only grows in places where everyone around you is already exceptional. The SEAL platoon that occupied Training Yard 7 that Tuesday was not just any group of operators. They were Tier 1, the best of the best, and they knew it in their bones, in the way they moved, in the way they didn't bother looking up when a vehicle pulled through the gate at 0630. Cole Maddox stood at the far end of the yard with his arms crossed and his eyes already carrying a verdict. He was 41 years old, 13 years as a senior chief, built like someone had stacked two men on top of each other and told them to cooperate. He had done things in places that didn't appear on any map, and he had brought every one of his operators home. That record was the reason he walked the way he did. Like gravity was slightly negotiable for men of his standing. Beside him stood Briggs Marcus Briggs, the platoon's strongest operator and its loudest personality. Briggs was the kind of man who made rooms feel smaller just by entering them. 6'3", 240 pounds, with a jaw that looked like it had been carved from something geological. He had 3 combat deployments, 2 commendations, and an opinion on absolutely everything. So what do we know about this instructor? Briggs asked, not because he particularly cared, but because asking questions in a dismissive tone was its own kind of performance. Cole unfolded the single-page briefing he'd been handed the night before. Marine Combat Systems, certified in close quarters doctrine, operator conditioning force application theory. He paused. Age 24. Briggs turned slowly and looked at Cole with an expression that could only be described as theatrical disbelief. 24. 24. Cole, I have boots that are 24. I know. My first deployment was at 24. Briggs, I'm just saying, I know what you're saying. Cole folded the paper and pushed it into his back pocket. Let's just see what Warcom actually sent us before we start writing the after-action report. But the tone had already been set. And by the time the word spread through the platoon, 12 operators in total gathering in loose clusters near the equipment racks, stretching taping knuckles, drinking coffee from paper cups, the temperature of the yard had already shifted from professional skepticism to something closer to open amusement. Mara Ellis was the only one who didn't laugh. She stood near the western wall away from Briggs and the others, running her hands slowly over the edge of a training mat with a focused expression that nobody in the platoon ever seemed to notice. Mara was 29, 5'6", the only female operator in the platoon, and she had spent 2 years learning how to make herself smaller in every room she entered, not because she was weak, but because she had learned that being underestimated was sometimes the only tactical advantage she could guarantee herself. She had heard the same jokes for 2 years. They didn't land anymore, but they also never quite stopped cutting. When the gate opened and the new instructor walked in, Mara was the first one to see her clearly. Ava Mercer carried a single bag over one shoulder and a folder in her left hand. She walked at a pace that was unhurried but precise, each step placed with the kind of deliberate calm that most people spend years failing to develop. She was, as the briefing had suggested, not physically imposing. 5'4" in boots, lean with dark hair pulled back tight, and eyes that were doing something that most people in that yard would not have been able to name immediately. She was reading the yard, not looking at it, reading it, processing every person, every posture, every cluster of body language. She had been doing it since before the gate finished swinging open, and she had already drawn conclusions that none of the 12 operators watching her understood she was drawing. "That's her," someone said from the group near Briggs. "That's her." Briggs turned to look, and then he did something that was worse than laughing. He let a slow, deliberate smile spread across his face, the kind that said the decision had been made and the conversation was already over. He raised his voice just enough to be heard across half the yard. "Hey, who called for the fitness instructors? Anyone order a fitness instructor?" A few of the men laughed. One of them, Torres, the youngest operator in the group at 22, had the decency to look at the ground after he laughed like some part of him knew better, even if he couldn't stop himself. Ava heard it. She didn't slow down. She didn't look in Briggs's direction. She walked to the center of the yard, set her bag down, placed the folder on top of it, and stood with her feet shoulder-width apart, her hands loose at her sides. Cole walked toward her because that was his job, and professionalism was a thing he believed in even when he didn't feel it. He stopped 6 feet away, squared his shoulders, and gave a single nod. "Senior Chief Cole Maddox, Platoon Commander. Ava Mercer, Marine Combat Systems. I'll be with you for 3 weeks." Her voice was calm, not quiet, not loud, just completely unnervingly even, like a surface without a ripple. Cole studied her face for a second. He had spent 13 years reading people, and what he saw in Ava Mercer's expression bothered him more than her age or her rank or her size. What he saw was someone who had already considered every possible reaction in this yard and was not worried about a single one of them. 3 weeks, he repeated. 3 weeks, she said. After that, what you do with the system is yours. What system is that? The one that's going to change how your platoon moves. Cole let the silence sit for a moment. Behind him, he heard Briggs shift his weight and let out a breath that was half laugh. Cole didn't turn around. "Warcom briefed us that you're here for operator conditioning and close quarters doctrine review," Cole said. "Warcom briefed you what fits on a single page," Ava said. "What I'm here to do takes 3 weeks to explain correctly." She glanced briefly past Cole to the group of operators watching from various distances. "And it's going to feel wrong to all of them before it starts feeling right. I want to be upfront about that." Cole looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "All right, Marine, the yard is yours." He stepped back, and that was when Briggs walked forward. Not because Cole had called him, not because the structure of the session invited it. Briggs walked forward because Briggs was the kind of man who filled silences he didn't like with the weight of his own body, and the silence that had just settled over the yard was one he didn't like at all. "Before we get into whatever system you've got," Briggs said, stopping about 8 feet from Ava and spreading his hands slightly at his sides, the universal posture of a man offering himself as evidence. "Maybe you want to tell us what makes a 24-year-old Marine the right person to be teaching a Tier 1 SEAL platoon anything." The yard was very still. Ava looked at him, not up at him, even though she had to angle her chin slightly to meet his eyes. She looked at him the way a chess player looks at an opponent's opening move, not threatened, not impressed, just registering. "That's a fair question," she said. "I think so. The honest answer is that I'm not here because I'm better than any of you. I'm here because I understand something about how force works that your current training doesn't address." She paused. "If you'd prefer a credential recitation, I can do that. But I don't think that's actually what you're asking." Briggs tilted his head. "So what am I asking?" "You're asking whether I belong here." She said it without accusation, without defensiveness, without anything that qualified as emotion. She said it the way someone names a fact they've already moved past. And the answer to that question isn't going to come from me talking. "So let's do something else." She looked at him steadily. "Come at me," she said, "however you'd go after someone in a confined space. Full speed, full commitment. Don't make it clean for me." The yard inhaled. Cole, standing to the side, felt his jaw tighten. His instinct was to say something, to call it, to establish parameters, to do the command function that protected his operators and controlled variables. But something stopped him. He wasn't sure what. Maybe it was the fact that Ava had already clearly thought about this moment and had chosen it deliberately. Maybe it was the tone in her voice that contained not a single trace of bravado, which was somehow more unsettling than if she'd been openly aggressive. He let it go. Briggs looked at the men around him. A few of them raised their eyebrows. Torres' mouth was partially open. The operator to Briggs' left, a veteran named Hackett, crossed his arms slowly. "You sure about this?" Briggs asked. "Yes," Ava said. Briggs moved. He was fast, genuinely fast, faster than most people who hadn't seen a trained operator up close would have believed, and he came in with a right-side drive, his weight shifting forward, both arms reaching for control of her torso. It was not a sloppy movement. It was a trained, coordinated real speed attempt to close distance and establish dominant grip. It took 1.5 seconds. What happened in those 1.5 seconds defied for every person in that yard their existing model of how physical interaction between two people of that size difference was supposed to work. Ava didn't move backward. She moved at an angle a single step to her left and slightly forward, which took her completely out of Briggs's primary line of force while rotating her inside his reaching arms. Her right hand connected with the inside of his forearm, not grabbing, not striking, just redirecting, and her left hand found the back of his shoulder at the exact moment his weight committed to the forward drive. She used none of her own force. She used all of his. Briggs went down. Not falling, not stumbling, down controlled complete, the full 240 pounds of him, arriving at the training mat with a sound that settled into the morning air like a sentence that couldn't be taken back. He was on his back. She was standing. Her breathing had not changed. The silence that followed was a different kind of silence than the one that had preceded it. Before the silence had been comfortable, the silence of a group of men who thought they knew what was going to happen. This silence was the one that comes after a belief breaks. Hackett uncrossed his arms. Torres closed his mouth. Cole said nothing, but his eyes moved from Briggs on the ground to Ava standing above him to Briggs again, and something in his expression shifted the way a door shifts when a latch releases not open, not quite, but no longer sealed in the way it was before. Briggs lay still for exactly 3 seconds. Then he pushed himself up to one elbow and looked at Ava with an expression that wasn't anger. It was something more honest than anger. "What was that?" he asked. "That was your force," she said. "I just stopped adding to it." Briggs got to his feet slowly, and he had the quality of a man who was very carefully recalibrating his assessment of a situation. He brushed his hand across the back of his neck and looked at Cole. Cole looked back at him. Neither of them said anything. Ava picked up her folder from the top of her bag. She opened it and removed a single printed page, which she held loosely at her side. She looked at the assembled platoon with that same reading expression she'd worn when she walked through the gate, quiet present, processing everything. "Here's what I want you to understand before we go any further," she said. "What just happened had nothing to do with me being strong or fast or trained beyond what you'd expect. What happened is that Marcus committed his entire body to a forward line of force, and instead of meeting that force, I moved with it and redirected it. He threw himself. I was just present for the landing." Briggs, now standing again, said quietly, "That's a very polite way to describe throwing me on my back." A few of the men laughed genuinely this time, not the dismissive laughter from before, but the slightly nervous laughter of people who have just seen something they don't fully understand and need to release the pressure of not understanding it. Ava let the laughter breathe for a second, then continued. "Your training is built on the idea that superior force defeats inferior force, and that's correct in a direct contest. But most of the situations your platoon is going to face in the next 18 months, specifically the mission environment you're being prepared for, are not going to offer you direct contests. They're going to offer you corridors, confined spaces, noise confusion, partial visibility, situations where your instinct to lead with power is going to create predictable patterns." She paused. "And predictable patterns in a confined engagement get people killed." The yard was quiet. Cole, who had not moved from his position 5 paces to the left of the training area, was looking at her with an expression that had settled into something that was not approval, but was not dismissal either. It was the expression of a man who had encountered a variable he had not accounted for and was now running the numbers. He did not like running numbers he hadn't already run. That was the part of this that bothered him most. "You said you'd be with us 3 weeks, he said. "Yes." "What does week 1 look like?" Ava reached into her folder and produced 3 more pages, which she held out in his direction. Cole crossed the distance between them and took the pages. He looked at the first one. It was not what he expected. There were no exercises listed, no physical standards, no conditioning protocols. The page had 4 words at the top in plain block letters: "Where your force goes." Below it was a series of body diagrams, not of the human form in combat positions, but of arrows. Lines of force, lines of movement, intersections, and angles. Cole stared at it for longer than he intended to. Week 1, Ava said, is entirely about understanding how the force you already generate that is currently working against you, not sometimes, not in edge cases, routinely. In your standard approach patterns, your breach postures, your instinctive response sequences under pressure. All of it. She looked at Cole directly. You're all extraordinary athletes. I'm not here to change that. I'm here to show you what extraordinary athletes can do when they stop fighting their own momentum. Cole looked at the page for another moment. Then he looked up at her. All right, he said, start wherever you need to. Ava nodded once. She reached into her bag and produced a series of colored tape rolls, red, blue, white, and tossed them to Hackett. Torres and a third operator named Delgado without any explanation. Tape out a corridor, 6 feet wide, 20 feet long, one turn. Put the turn at the midpoint. The men looked at each other, then at the tape in their hands, then began laying it out on the training mat. Nobody asked why. That was the first sign, the first subtle, almost invisible sign that Ava Mercer had already begun to shift something in the yard that had nothing to do with the physical training that was coming. Mara Ellis moved slightly closer to the group. Not enough for anyone to notice, but closer. She had watched the interaction with Briggs, and she had not reacted the way the others had. Not the dismissive laughter before, not the startled recalibration after. Mara had watched with the concentrated attention of someone watching a language being spoken that they have been trying to learn for a long time without quite having the right teacher. When the tape corridor was finished, Ava walked into it alone. She stood at one end and looked down its length toward the turn. Torres, she said without looking back. Yes, ma'am. Walk the corridor at a normal patrol pace. Don't do anything differently than you do it on a real approach. Torres stepped in. He moved the way a trained SEAL moves, controlled, deliberate, weight distributed. He reached the turn, pivoted in a tight angle, continued. Ava watched every moment. Stop, she said when he reached the far end. Torres stopped. What did you do at the turn? Torres looked at his own feet for a second, then back at her. Pivoted inside. Did you slow down before the pivot? Torres paused. A little. Why? Another pause. Because the angle. Because your body knew the momentum wasn't going to cooperate with the angle, Ava said. So it compensated by reducing speed to maintain control. Yes, Torres said slowly. Yeah, that's yes. That deceleration, Ava said, takes approximately a quarter of a second in a trained operator. In a confined engagement, a quarter of a second is enough time for an opponent who understands momentum to establish dominant position before you complete your turn. She looked at the rest of the platoon. How many of you have trained breach and clear in corridors with a turn inside 15 feet of the entry point? Every hand went up. And how many of you have had an instinct, not a thought, an instinct to slow slightly before the turn? Fewer hands, but Cole's went up, and Hackett's, and after a moment of visible internal debate, Briggs's. Ava said nothing for a moment. She let the raised hands be seen by every person in the yard. Then she walked to the start of the corridor and moved through it herself. At the turn, she did not slow down. Her speed at entry was identical to her speed at the pivot, and at the pivot, her body did not break. Instead, her outside foot planted and redirected with a single motion that rolled her momentum around the corner rather than fighting it. She came out of the turn at the same pace she went in, and her body position at the exit was already squared for engagement. The whole sequence lasted approximately the same time as Torres's, but the energy signature was completely different. There was no moment of vulnerability at the turn. Cole watched it twice in his mind after it was done, once in real time, once broken down into the components he'd been trained to analyze, and he found to his genuine discomfort that he couldn't immediately identify the mechanical technique she'd used to accomplish what he'd just seen. He had been doing this for 13 years. He could identify technique. That was a thing he could reliably do. He couldn't identify this one. Run it again, he said. Ava looked at him. You want to watch again, or you want to try it? Cole felt the eyes of his entire platoon on him. He was aware of this the way a commander is always aware of being watched, not anxiously, but as a permanent variable in every decision. What he said and did now would set a tone. He had set tones in this yard hundreds of times. This one felt different because the territory was unfamiliar. I'll watch once more, he said, then I'll run it. Ava ran it again. Same result. If anything, the second time it was cleaner, a demonstration rather than an execution. every component at three-quarter speed so the mechanics were visible. Cole watched the turn. He watched the foot placement. He watched the way her weight traveled through the pivot without stacking against the direction change. Then he walked to the start of the corridor. He moved through it the way he'd moved through 1,000 corridors, experienced, efficient, trained. At the turn, he felt his weight decelerate by the quarter-second fraction that Ava had named the instinctive brake that he'd never had a reason to think about before because it had never been named out loud in front of him. Now it was a thing he could hear. He came out the other side and stood at the far end of the corridor. He said nothing. Ava walked over to him. "What did you feel?" she asked. Cole looked at the corridor. "The brake." "Yes." "I didn't think about it. It was automatic." "It always is," she said. "That's what we're working with." He looked at her then, and it was not the look he'd given her when she walked through the gate. It wasn't agreement, and it wasn't trust. Those things were going to take more than a quarter in a morning. But it was the look of a man who has encountered a variable he can no longer dismiss, and who has enough professional honesty to acknowledge that fact even when he'd rather not. Behind him, Briggs was already walking to the start of the corridor. Nobody had told him to. He was just going. And that quiet, unprompted movement toward the thing that had just challenged everything he understood about how he worked was the first real change of the day. Not the takedown, not the demonstration. This. A 240-pound SEAL walking voluntarily toward a lesson he hadn't asked for. Mara Ellis saw it. She moved another step closer to the group. The morning was not over. The 3 weeks were barely started, and the yard at Naval Base Coronado, which had begun the day with laughter and certainty, was running now on something harder to name and harder to walk away from. Something that felt for the first time in a very long time like the edge of something genuinely new. Ava watched her platoon move. She watched Cole. She watched Briggs find his footing with the corridor turn on his third attempt and stop for a full second at the far end, looking at his own hands like they'd done something without his permission. She watched Mara Ellis watching all of it from the edge. And she thought 12 days to the halfway point, 21 to the end. Whatever mission was coming in 3 weeks, she didn't know the details. She'd been given a single-line descriptor, high probability, confined engagement, elevated risk of operator predictability, exploitation. She understood what that meant. She understood more importantly what had to change before it arrived. She looked back at Cole. He was walking the corridor again. Fourth time, he had not asked her any more questions. He was running the problem himself, which was the right instinct, even if the methodology was still off. She didn't say anything yet. Sometimes the most important thing a teacher does is stay quiet while the student discovers what the lesson actually is. The morning light at Coronado stretched across the yard. 12 operators moved and adjusted and failed and tried again. And Ava Mercer stood at the edge of the taped corridor and watched all of it with eyes that had already seen where this was going, not because she was clairvoyant, not because the ending was guaranteed, but because she understood the geometry of resistance. And she understood with a clarity that had taken her 24 years to earn that the moment a person genuinely stops fighting their own momentum is the moment they become capable of something they never were before. That moment for this platoon was coming. She could feel it building already in the quality of Briggs's silence, in the length of Cole's stare, in the way Mara Ellis had, without anyone noticing, moved all the way to the edge of the tape. Cole Maddox did not sleep well that night. He would not have admitted that to anyone in his platoon. He would not have admitted it to the base commander, or to the WARCOM liaison who had sent the orders, or to anyone who had been in that yard when Ava Mercer put Marcus Briggs on his back in under 2 seconds. But the truth was that he lay in his rack at 0200, staring at the ceiling with the image of that pivot running on a loop in his head, and he could not identify the technique. He had been trying for 4 hours. He still could not identify it. That bothered him more than he had words for. Cole Maddox built his world on known quantities. 13 years of command had given him a catalog. He could watch a man move for 30 seconds and tell you where he'd trained what his dominant hand was, where his instinct broke down under pressure. That catalog had never failed him. It was the instrument he trusted above all others, above orders, above intelligence reports, above the assessments of people who hadn't been in the room. Ava Mercer was not in his catalog. He was at the yard by 0545. She was already there. She was seated on the edge of the training mat with her eyes closed and her hands resting loosely on her knees, breathing at a rate that was slow enough to be deliberate and even enough to suggest she had been doing it for a while. She did not open her eyes when he walked in. She did not react to his footsteps. She simply sat and breathed and was present in the yard in a way that was completely different from the way 12 combat operators had filled the same space the previous morning. Cole stopped a few feet away and watched her for a moment. "You're early," he said. "So are you," she said without opening her eyes. He pulled a folding chair from the rack near the equipment wall and sat down across from her. He put his forearms on his knees and looked at the training mat and said, "I ran the corridor 12 times last night, in my head, trying to figure out what you did at the pivot." Ava opened her eyes. She looked at him with that same unreadable steadiness. "What did you find?" "Nothing I could name." She nodded slowly, like that was the answer she expected. "That's the first useful thing you've told me since I arrived." Cole looked at her. "Is that a compliment?" "It's an observation. Most operators at your level can't admit that. They find a name for something, even if the name is wrong, because having no name for it feels like losing." She paused. "You didn't do that. That means you're teachable." Cole held her gaze for a moment, and then something very unusual happened. He laughed. Not the controlled, performative laugh of a senior chief managing a room, but an actual, brief, genuine laugh. The sound of a man who has just been told something accurate and doesn't quite know what to do with it. "Teachable," he repeated. "It's not an insult." "I'm aware." He looked back at the mat. "What was it at the pivot? What were you actually doing?" "I wasn't fighting the corner," she said. "I was using the corner." "There's a difference. Your body has been trained to perceive the turn as an obstacle, something to be cleared and controlled. My body perceives the turn as stored energy. The corner doesn't take speed away, it converts it." She watched him process that. "The technique lives in how you load the outside foot a half step before the turn rather than at the turn. It redirects the momentum vector instead of canceling it." Cole sat with that for a long moment. Then he stood up, walked to the start of the tape corridor, and ran it. He felt the difference immediately. Not perfectly, it would take days before it became natural, but the half-step preload on the outside foot was there, and the corner came and went without the deceleration, and he came out the other side with his weight already forward instead of catching up. He stopped at the far end and turned around. Ava was watching him. "Again," she said. He ran it again. By the time the rest of the platoon arrived at 0630, Cole Maddox had run the corridor 23 times and had gotten it right on 11 of them. He was sweating. He had not noticed when the sweating started. Briggs came through the gate first, which was always the case. Briggs operated on the belief that arriving second meant you'd already lost something, and he stopped when he saw Cole at the far end of the corridor breathing hard, facing the tape line with the focused expression of a man doing math he hasn't fully solved. "You've been here long?" Briggs asked. "Long enough," Cole said. Briggs looked at Ava, then back at Cole. He did the calculation that Briggs always did the one that ran through his own ego first, and then, when the ego came back with no useful answer, arrived at something more honest. "She got you running the corridor drills at 0:30, he said. It wasn't a question. "She got me thinking about the corridor at 0:30, Cole said. "I came here on my own." Briggs looked at the tape floor, then at Cole, then very slowly he said, "That corner still feels wrong." "It feels wrong because we've been doing it wrong for years," Cole said. "Get your boots on the tape." Briggs blinked. Cole Maddox had just told him in 11 words that something they'd both been doing for years was incorrect. Briggs stood in the gate of the yard and processed that for exactly 4 seconds. Then he dropped his bag and walked to the start of the corridor. The rest of the platoon filtered in over the next 10 minutes. Mara Ellis came in quietly as she always did and took a position slightly away from the primary cluster and watched the corridor tape with an expression that suggested she had been thinking about it since she left the yard the previous afternoon. Torres came in talking. He was always talking, but his voice dropped off when he saw Cole and Briggs already running drills, and the talking stopped. Ava let them settle. She was not a person who needed silence imposed by command. She achieved it by simply not filling it, by waiting with the patient, unhurried quality of someone who understood that the most important thing about the beginning of a session was letting everyone arrive fully before anything began. When they were all present, she said, "Yesterday we talked about momentum. Today we go deeper, and some of what I'm going to tell you is going to feel like I'm criticizing your training. I'm not. I'm identifying a gap that your training wasn't designed to address because the people who designed it weren't thinking about the specific mission geometry you're being prepared for. She let that land. Strength-based close quarters response is the correct doctrine for most engagement types. What we're building here is not a replacement for that doctrine. It's a layer on top of it. What happens in corridors, stairwells, vehicle interiors, compressed spaces where your physical advantage is neutralized by geometry. She held up one hand palm outward. When the corridor is 6 feet wide and your target has already identified your approach angle, your size and your strength are no longer assets. They are predictions. Predictions that a prepared opponent can exploit. The yard was quiet. Hackett, who was the platoon's most experienced operator and the least likely to say anything without having thought it through twice, raised one hand. "You're talking about the mission package," he said. It was not a question. Ava looked at him. "I'm talking about geometry. The mission package has details I haven't been read in on. But yes, the environment described in the training brief maps directly to what I'm here to prepare you for." Hackett nodded once and said nothing further. Cole was watching this exchange from the side. He noted what he always noted: who spoke when and why. Hackett speaking was significant. Hackett speaking early in a session was the equivalent of most men delivering a formal endorsement. He didn't do it casually, and when he did it, the platoon heard it. The temperature of the yard had shifted again. Not dramatically, but it had shifted. "4 attackers," Ava said, simultaneously. "I want 4 of you in the corridor at the far end. I'll enter from this side. Your job is to stop me from reaching the turn." The yard went very still. Torres said, "All 4 at once." "All 4 at once." Briggs was already stepping forward. He looked at Torres, at Hackett, at a quiet veteran named Reyes who had said almost nothing in 2 days and watched everything. "You 3, Briggs said, "let's go." They positioned themselves at the far end of the corridor. Not bunched trains spread correctly, filling the 6-foot width with overlapping coverage angles. It was a good defensive setup. It was, in fact, exactly the right way to hold a 6-foot corridor against a single incoming contact. Ava stood at the entry end. She looked at the 4 of them. She rolled her neck once slowly. Then she said, "Ready when you are." Briggs said, "Go." What happened in the next 41 seconds was something that every person in that yard would describe differently when asked about it later. Not because they saw different things, but because what they saw did not fit cleanly into any language they currently owned for physical interaction. Ava entered the corridor at a pace that was not a run. It was faster than a walk, more deliberate than a sprint, a kind of controlled momentum that made her body feel like a question being asked of the space around her. Reyes moved to intercept. First, he was the fastest in the 4-man group, and she responded to his movement by not responding to it at all, which was somehow worse than if she had dodged, because her line didn't change, and Reyes found himself committing to an angle that was no longer where she was. She was past him before the correction was possible. Torres moved from the right side with a 2-arm reach, and she took his momentum and converted it the way she had described, not blocking, not stopping, redirecting his own forward drive, becoming a rotation that took him into Hackett rather than into her. Hackett, who had been moving to fill the gap Torres vacated, received Torres instead of receiving Ava. And for approximately 1 full second, the right side of the corridor was occupied by 2 large men, resolving a collision that neither of them had planned. Briggs was the last barrier. He had watched all of it in real time, and he had made adjustments, positioned himself at the turn itself, where the geometry was tightest, where he had the most leverage. He was lower than he'd been in their first encounter, weight already distributed, arms ready for contact rather than reach. Ava came to the turn. She did not slow down. She loaded her outside foot. Cole, watching from the side, saw it and felt something tighten in his chest, and she came around the turn at full speed, and her angle of approach to Briggs was not what the corridor suggested it should be. She was inside his arm reach before he had fully processed that she was there, and her hand found the back of his shoulder at a point that his body's own structure made impossible to resist. And she used the corner. She used the geometry of the turn itself as stored energy, the way she had described in the early morning. And Briggs went sideways rather than backward, not falling, rotating his body, making a controlled quarter turn that deposited him against the corridor wall with his own hands already up to catch himself. The corridor was clear. Ava stood at the exit end. Her breathing was elevated but controlled. She was not in distress. She looked back at four operators who were in various states of physical recovery and psychological recalibration and said nothing. The yard was completely silent. Briggs was still against the wall. He was looking at the ceiling with an expression that had nothing left in it of the man who had laughed in the gate that first morning. He said to no one in particular, "She used me to stop herself." "She used the corner to stop herself," Hackett said quietly from his position on the floor. "And then she used you to confirm the exit angle." "Yeah," Briggs said. "Yeah." Cole stood at the side of the corridor and felt something he had not felt in a professional context in a very long time. He felt the particular specific discomfort of realizing that an entire category of his knowledge had a ceiling he had never seen before, and that he was now standing directly under it. He looked at Ava. She was looking at him. "Questionless," he said. It wasn't quite a question and wasn't quite a statement. It was the sound of a man opening a door. "Many," she said. "That's good." "The angle on Briggs at the exit. You changed your approach line inside the turn. That shouldn't have been possible at that speed." "It was possible because the turn stored the energy that allowed the line change. At full deceleration, you're right, the geometry doesn't work. At converted momentum, it does." She looked at Briggs. He was set up perfectly for a static defender. Against a static incoming force, his position was correct. But I wasn't static. My line was changing continuously, which meant the position he'd chosen was already historical by the time I arrived. Briggs said from the wall. "She's saying I was defending against where she used to be." "That's exactly what I'm saying," Ava said. Briggs pushed himself off the wall and stood up. He looked at the corridor. He looked at Ava. He looked at Cole. And then he said something that nobody in the platoon expected him to say, because Marcus Briggs did not say things like this, because Marcus Briggs did not process defeat. In real time, he processed it later privately and converted it into fuel that nobody else got to see. He said, "I think I'm in." 3 words: quiet, direct, without qualification. Cole heard it. The platoon heard it. And the yard, which had been recalibrating for 2 days, completed a recalibration in that moment that all the corridor demonstrations and takedown sequences had been building toward. Because if Briggs was in, the question was no longer whether the system worked. The question was how fast they could learn it. Mara Ellis had been watching all of it from the left side of the yard, and when Briggs said those 3 words, she felt something move through her chest that she didn't immediately have a name for. She'd been in this platoon for 2 years. She had been physically capable for every day of those 2 years. She had been underestimated for every day of those 2 years. And she had watched Ava Mercer walk into a yard full of men who had already decided what she was and changed the architecture of their certainty in 48 hours. That feeling in Mara's chest was recognition. She stepped forward. "Can I run it?" she asked. The question landed in the space where the platoon's attention was already focused. Cole looked at her. Briggs looked at her. Ava looked at her. Ava said yes. Mara walked to the entry end of the corridor. She stood at the tape line and looked down its length and felt the geometry in a way she hadn't the day before, because now she had context. Now she had seen what the corner could be used for. She ran it. Not perfectly, she decelerated at the turn, the same instinctive brake everyone had, but she caught it mid-motion and made the correction, and the quality of her movement at the exit was different from her entry in a way that was immediately visible. Not as clean as Ava's, but recognizably, genuinely attempting the same principle. She stopped at the exit end and turned around. Ava said, "What did you feel at the turn?" "I braked," Mara said, "and then I felt it, the load on the outside foot. I was late with it." "You were late," Ava said, "but you felt it. That's the lesson for today. Most people don't feel it on the first run. They don't feel it on the 5th run. You felt it on the first." She looked at Mara directly. "What's your name?" "Ellis, Mara Ellis." "Mara," Ava said, "run it again." Something shifted in the yard. Not loudly, not with any dramatic announcement, but the 12 operators in that space had just watched the platoon's quietest, most consistently overlooked member run a quarter and receive a correction and a directive from the instructor without any of the buffering or qualification that most of the men in the group had unconsciously expected to see applied to her. Ava had spoken to Mara exactly the way she spoke to Cole, exactly the way she spoke to Briggs. There was no adjustment for size, for gender, for position in the platoon hierarchy. There was only the work and whether you were doing it. Mara ran it again. Her outside foot loaded a quarter step earlier, and the turn came through without the brake, and she came out the other side with her weight already committed forward. Not perfect, clean enough to see the principle working in her body. Briggs said quietly to no one in particular, huh? Cole was watching Mara. He had been watching her in a different way than he'd been watching the rest of the session, with the particular attention of a commander who has just noticed something he should have noticed before, which is always an uncomfortable kind of attention because it comes packaged with the awareness of the time it took to arrive. He had seen Mara train for 2 years. He had assessed her as capable, reliable, and competent in all standard operator functions. He had never not once considered whether her specific body geometry gave her a structural advantage in the kind of movement system Ava was teaching. He had not considered it because it had not been relevant to any prior training framework. It was relevant now. And as Mara ran the corridor a third time, and the outside footload was there from the first step clean and early, and already becoming instinct, Cole found himself watching with the attention he reserved for operators who were becoming something. Ava ran the full group through 3 hours of corridor work. By the end of the first hour, 7 of the 12 operators had found the pivot principle at least once. By the end of the second hour, 11 of them were hitting it on more than half their runs. By the end of the third hicket, the most methodical learner in the group, the one who needed to understand the why before the how, ran the corridor 6 consecutive times without a single deceleration at the turn. He stopped after the 6th run and stood at the exit end and said, "It's a momentum accounting problem." Ava looked at him. "You're not adding or removing force," Hackett said, working it out as he spoke. "You're tracking where the existing force is going and directing it instead of fighting it. The corridor isn't the problem. The corridor is the resource." Ava said yes. "And this applies to opponent force as well as your own. Same principle, same mechanics, different source." Hackett nodded slowly. He looked at Briggs. "That's why she didn't strain when she put you down." Briggs said, "I know. She wasn't using her force, she was using yours." "I know, Hackett. She redirected." "I was there," Briggs said. "I remember being on the ground." A few of the men laughed. Real laughter, the kind that comes from a group that has moved through something together and arrived at a place where the tension has converted into something functional. Cole heard it and felt the particular relief of a commander whose platoon is cohering rather than fracturing. He looked at Ava. She was making notes in her folder, small, precise notations that he couldn't read from where he stood. She was cataloging them, tracking their learning curves, their instinctive patterns, their individual responses to the system. She had been doing it the whole session quietly between instructions. He realized he hadn't seen her make a single mistake. Not a miscue, not a miscommunication, not a moment where the instructions she gave didn't match the outcome she was after. 3 hours of work with 12 operators at varying stages of comprehension and resistance, and she had managed every variable without raising her voice, without asserting authority, through anything other than the precision of what she was doing. 13 years. He had seen instructors come through this yard, veterans, specialists, contractors, the best credentialed practitioners the community could produce. And what he was watching Ava Mercer do was in a category that he did not have a prior reference for. He was still thinking about that when she closed the folder and said, "Tomorrow we add the opponent." The platoon looked at her. "You've been practicing the corridor with yourself as the only variable," she said. "Tomorrow we add a second variable, a trained opponent who knows you're coming. Same corridor, same turn, different problem." She looked at the group. "Think tonight about what you assume when you enter a confined space with a known threat. What you know, what you believe you know, and the difference between those two things." She picked up her bag. "That difference," she said, "is where people die." She walked toward the gate. Nobody said anything until she was through it. Then Torres said, "She just ended the session by telling us we might die." "She ended the session by telling us why the session matters," Hackett said. Briggs was looking at the corridor tape. He was looking at the turn specifically, and his expression was the one he wore when he was running numbers on something that didn't add up the way he expected. Cole said, "Briggs." Briggs looked at him. "What are you thinking?" Briggs said, "I'm thinking about what she said, about defending against where someone used to be." He paused. "I've been doing that my whole career. Every defensive posture I have is built on reading where the opponent is going and positioning for that point. But if the opponent's line is changing continuously, he stopped. Then the position is already wrong by the time you arrive at it, Cole said. Yeah. Cole looked at the quarter. We've been training for static predictions in dynamic environments. Yeah. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Then Cole said, get some rest. Tomorrow gets harder. Briggs nodded. He picked up his bag. He walked toward the gate and he stopped at the threshold and turned around. Cole, he said. Cole looked at him. She's the real thing, Briggs said. Not loudly, not as a performance, just as a statement of fact delivered by a man who had spent 2 days resisting that fact and had run out of resistance. Cole held his gaze for a moment. Yeah, he said. She is. Briggs left. Cole stood alone in the yard with the corridor tape at his feet and the morning light coming in at a long angle and the feeling of a man standing at the beginning of something that is going to require more from him than he has recently been asked to give. He walked to the start of the corridor. He ran it one more time. The outside foot loaded early. The turn came through without the brake. He came out the exit end with his weight forward and his eyes already scanning for the next threat variable. Not perfect. Closer than yesterday. He stood at the exit and thought about what Ava had said about the mission geometry. 3 weeks. Confined spaces, compressed angles, the kind of environment where size and strength became predictions rather than advantages. He thought about what Hackett said, momentum accounting. He thought about what Briggs said, defending against where someone used to be. He thought about Mara Ellis running the corridor and feeling the outside footload on the first attempt. He thought about what he might have been missing for how long and what that cost might have been in environments where the accounting had real stakes. Then he picked up his bag. Tomorrow would be harder. She had told him that, and he believed her completely now in a way he would not have believed anything she said 48 hours ago. He walked through the gate. The yard was empty. The tape was still on the floor, marking a corridor, marking a turn, marking the geometry of a problem that 12 operators were now carrying with them into their sleep. In 3 weeks, that problem would have a real corridor attached to it. They were not ready yet, but they were no longer who they were when the week began. And that Cole Maddox understood as he walked to his vehicle in the morning light was exactly what the 3 weeks were for. The second night was different from the first. Cole knew it the moment he sat down in his rack and realized he wasn't staring at the ceiling, trying to reverse engineer a technique. He was thinking about Hackett's words, momentum accounting. He was thinking about Briggs at the gate delivering a verdict without theater. He was thinking about Mara Ellis and the outside footloading early on the first attempt, and what that meant about a person he had been looking at for 2 years without fully seeing. He slept 4 hours. It wasn't enough. He didn't care. By 05:30, he was in the yard again. Ava was already there again. This was becoming a pattern, and Cole had decided he was going to stop being surprised by it and start using it. He pulled the folding chair up and sat down across from her before she opened her eyes, and when she did open them, she found him already looking at her with the expression of a man who came with a list. The opponent variable, he said. Tell me what tomorrow looks like before it happens. Ava studied him for a moment. You want to pre-brief? I want to understand the structure before my people are inside it. She nodded. She reached into her bag and pulled out the folder. She didn't open it. She just held it in her lap and said, today is not about the corridor. Today is about what your operators believe when they're inside the corridor. The assumptions they carry in without knowing they're carrying them. She paused. Every trained operator that has a decision tree, a sequence of if-then responses built by thousands of hours of repetition. Under pressure, they don't think. They execute the tree. That's the point of the training, Cole said. That's the point of the training for known threat variables, Ava said. But the decision tree has a vulnerability. It's built on the assumption that the opponent is also executing a predictable sequence. When the opponent breaks pattern, when they do something, the tree doesn't have a branch for the operator doesn't adapt. The operator freezes for a fraction of a second while the tree searches for a matching branch. She looked at him. In a corridor, a fraction of a second is the whole game. Cole sat with that. He thought about the mission package. He thought about the geometry descriptor in the brief, confined, multi-turn, elevated ambient noise, partial visibility. He thought about 12 operators running decision trees in an environment specifically designed to break decision trees. So today you break the trees, he said. Today I show them the trees, she said. Breaking them comes later. The platoon came in at 0630 with a different energy than the previous 2 mornings. The first morning had been contempt. The second had been recalibration. This morning was something harder to name, a kind of alert readiness, the quality of people who have been told tomorrow gets harder and believed it and spent the night running the implications. Briggs came in first and went directly to the quarter tape without speaking to anyone. He ran the turn twice before the rest of the platoon had their gears sorted, and the second run was clean enough that Torres, watching from across the yard, said quietly to no one in particular, "He's been practicing." Mara came in and went to the left side of the yard and stood with her eyes on the corridor and her hands loose at her sides. Cole watched her from across the space and thought about the outside foot loading early. He thought about what Ava had said, most people don't feel it on the first run. He thought about 2 years of evaluations and assessments in what category he had consistently placed Mara Ellis in. And he felt the specific discomfort of a man in the process of revising a conclusion he had held with confidence. Ava let them settle for exactly 90 seconds. Then she said, "Pair up. One of you is going to enter the corridor. The other is going to stand at the turn with their eyes closed." The yard went still. Torres said, "Eyes closed." "Eyes closed," Ava confirmed. The person at the turn cannot see the person entering. They can only hear. Their job is to identify the moment the entering operator commits to a direction before the entering operator arrives at the turn, and then step into that direction. Briggs said, "Step into it." "Step into the line of committed force," Ava said. "Not to intercept, not to engage, just to occupy the space where the momentum is already going." The operators looked at each other. Cole could see them running the exercise in their heads, and he could see the moment each of them hit the same wall, because the exercise was not physically demanding in any way they were accustomed to measuring. It was asking them to do something their training had never specifically developed. It was asking them to listen for commitment. Hackett said slowly, "You're training proprioception." Ava looked at him. "Expand that. You're not training us to see the threat. You're training us to feel the force field around the threat, the commitment signature before physical contact." Hackett's expression was the one he wore when a mechanical problem resolved itself inside his head. Because in a corridor with noise and partial visibility, sight is the last sense to give you useful information. Sight is the slowest sense under those conditions, Ava said. It requires processing time. What arrives faster is pressure, air displacement, sound pattern, vibration through the floor if the structure is right. She looked at the group. Your bodies already know how to read these things. Your training has been overriding that capacity with visual protocols for so long that you've lost access to it. Today we start getting it back. The pairing happened quickly. Cole paired with Hackett, which was a deliberate choice. He wanted to run the exercise with the person most likely to articulate what was happening as it happened, because Cole needed language for the experience before he could evaluate it accurately. Briggs paired with Torres. Mara paired with Reyes. The first runs were chaos. Not physical chaos. Nobody fell. Nobody collided badly, but cognitive case. The disorientation of 12 trained operators discovering simultaneously that a capacity they'd assumed they possessed was in fact significantly underdeveloped. The person at the turn with eyes closed would step into a space that was half a beat off from where the incoming operator actually committed, or would step too early and remove themselves from the path entirely, or would freeze at the critical moment trying to process audio data through visual interpretation protocols and arrive half a second late. Half a second late in a quarter was the whole game. They all knew it now. Cole stood at the turn with his eyes closed and listened to Hackett approach from the entry in, and in the moment before Hackett committed to the final angle, Cole felt something he could not immediately name. Not a sound, not a vibration, exactly, a change in the pressure of the air around his right shoulder. He stepped into it. He was 1 foot behind the right position, close enough to feel the miss. He opened his eyes and stood there for a moment and then said to Hackett, "Run it again." Hackett ran it again. Cole closed his eyes. He emptied the decision tree as much as a man with 13 years of deeply grooved reflexes could empty it. He waited. He felt the air change again on his right side slightly earlier than before, and this time he understood what he was feeling. Hackett's weight was loading onto the right foot at the turn's approach, displacing the air column along his line of movement, in a way that was real and readable and had been there all along. Invisible only because Cole had never been told to look for it. He stepped. He was in the right place. Hackett's shoulder connected with his chest with the light confirming pressure of a body arriving exactly where another body was already standing. Hackett said, "You had it." "I had it," Cole said. He turned around and looked at Ava, who was standing at the entry end of the corridor. She was watching him with the same expression she'd had the morning in the early light when he told her he couldn't identify the technique, the expression of someone receiving the right answer. He said, "This is what you meant about the trees." "The tree was looking for visual data to process," she said. "When you let the tree go quiet, the other information came through." "Air displacement," he said. "Weight transfer, air displacement. Floor vibration, breath pattern," she said. "In combination. Your nervous system reads all of it simultaneously without any instruction from you. It was reading it this morning. It's been reading it your entire career. You just couldn't hear it over the sound of the visual processing." Cole looked at the corridor. He felt something shift in his chest, not the professional recalibration of the past 2 days, but something older and more personal. Something that felt like looking at a tool he'd been carrying for 41 years and realizing he had never learned its primary function. "Run it again," he said to Hackett. They ran it 7 more times. By the 4th, Cole was reading the commitment and signature without the half-second delay. By the 7th, he stepped into position before Hackett had fully committed, working from the weight load alone. Across the yard, the other pairs were having their own versions of the same experience. Torres, who talked constantly during every training session, had gone completely quiet inside the corridor. Mara at the turn was hitting her positions at a rate that was making Reyes visibly uncomfortable, because Reyes was a 16-year veteran who was being read like a page by someone half his age in terms of operational experience. Briggs was struggling. This was the thing that nobody in the yard said out loud, but everyone noticed. Briggs, whose physical gifts had always operated as a solution to every problem, was finding that this particular problem did not respond to physical gifts. The capacity being trained was one that rewarded stillness, sensitivity, and the willingness to receive information passively rather than generate it actively. These were not Briggs's native settings. Briggs's native settings were forceful forward, decisive, all the qualities that made him the platoon's most dominant operator in direct engagement, and the least naturally equipped person in the yard for what Ava was asking. He ran the turn position 8 times. He was right on 4 of them, which was better than several of the others, but his 4 correct reads were loud, full-body committed steps that arrived correctly, but carried the energy of someone arriving at a conclusion rather than receiving one. His 4 misses were complete misses, not near misses, because when Briggs was wrong, he was comprehensively wrong, his decision tree executing all the way through before the error became apparent. After the 8th run, he stepped out of the corridor and stood with his hands on his hips and his jaw tight. Ava walked over to him. Cole watched from across the yard and did not intervene because this was not the moment for a senior chief to manage. This was the moment for the instructor to meet the student where the student was. And Ava had already demonstrated she knew how to do that better than anyone Cole had seen. "Talk to me," Ava said to Briggs. Briggs looked at the corridor. "I'm reading it wrong. I know I'm reading it wrong. I just can't find the right read." "What are you listening for?" "Sound, footfall pattern, the change in the..." He stopped. "I'm listening for something I can categorize, something I can name. And I can't name air displacement without training myself to call it something. So I'm listening for what I already have words for, and that's a half-second behind where I need to be." Ava said, "Yes, that's exactly right." Briggs looked at her sharply. "That's not a solution. It's a diagnosis," she said. "The solution is to stop naming it. Stop trying to categorize the input and just receive it. Your nervous system knows what it is. The problem is the part of your brain that wants to classify it before you act on it. That part is your enemy in this exercise." Briggs stared at her. "You're telling me to think less." "I'm telling you that the part of you that's doing the thinking is not the part of you that can do this," she said. "For this exercise, that part needs to be quiet. Every operator in this yard is good at active cognition under pressure. What I'm asking for is something different. Passive reception under pressure. It's a different mode. It feels like doing nothing. And doing nothing is the hardest thing in the world for someone trained to do everything." Briggs was silent for a long moment. Then he said, I've never been told to quiet my brain in a combat training context. I know, she said. That's why you haven't been able to do this yet. He looked at her. Something in his expression shifted, not softening exactly because Briggs didn't soften, but adjusting, reconfiguring around a new piece of information. One more run, he said. Take 30 seconds first, she said. Stand still. Don't think about the corridor. Don't think about the exercise. Just breathe. Briggs looked like he was about to argue. Then he closed his mouth and stood still and breathed. The entire yard had gone quiet around him. Everyone could see what was happening, and nobody was going to be the person who broke the moment. 30 seconds passed. Briggs walked back to the turn position. He closed his eyes. Torres entered the quarter from the far end. The silence in the yard was complete. Torres approached the turn. His footfall pattern was deliberate, trained quiet. He was trying to be unreadable and doing a reasonable job of it. At the turn's approach, he committed, left his weight loading onto the outside foot in the pattern Ava had been teaching for 3 days. Briggs stepped left. He was in the right place. Torres' shoulder connected with his chest. Both men went still for a second. Torres said, how did you? Briggs opened his eyes. He was looking at the corridor wall. His expression was the one Cole had never seen on him in 2 years of command, the expression of a man who has just discovered a room inside himself he didn't know was there. He said very quietly, I felt the floor. Ava said yes. His weight shifted onto the outside foot, and I felt it through the floor. Yes. I wasn't listening, I was just receiving, she said. Briggs said nothing for a moment. Then he stepped out of the corridor and walked to the edge of the yard and stood with his back to the group for about 10 seconds, and then he turned around and his face was completely clear, the way a face gets when something that was complicated has become simple. All right, he said. I understand what we're doing now. Cole had been watching all of this with the focused attention of a commander, running continuous assessment, and what he was assessing had been shifting steadily for 3 days in a direction that he had not anticipated when the orders arrived. He had expected a competent instructor. He had received something significantly beyond that category, and the gap between what he'd expected and what he was witnessing was producing in him a feeling that he only experienced when something fundamental was changing, not just tactically, but in the way he understood his own work. He walked to where Ava was standing. The mission package, he said. The brief said confined multi-turn elevated noise, partial visibility. You've been building for that from day one. Ava looked at him. Yes. How did you know the specific parameters? I've been briefed on the environment type, not the specific mission, she said. The geometry tells me what the body needs. I don't need the mission details to know what the gaps are. Cole looked at her steadily. You've run an operation in this geometry. It wasn't a question. It was a commander reading a person with 13 years of practice at exactly that task. Ava met his gaze without flinching and without confirming and without denying. She simply said, what I've experienced is what built the system. The system is what matters here. Cole held the look for a moment. Then he nodded once, respecting the boundary, filing the inference away in the part of his mind where he kept things that were relevant and unresolved. He said, 3 days in, where are we? Ahead of where I expected, she said. Your platoon learns faster than the average. Hackett is exceptional. He processes the mechanical principle and articulates it back accurately, which means he'll become a force multiplier for the others. Torres surprises me. He's more sensitive to the passive reception than his training profile suggested. She paused. And Ellis? Tell me about Ellis, Cole said. Ava looked across the yard to where Mara was standing at the quarter turn, with her eyes still closed, running Reyes through the entry for what looked like the 12th consecutive time. She's the most naturally equipped person in this yard for what I'm teaching, Ava said. Her decision tree is less deeply grooved than the others. She hasn't had as many years of active cognition-dominant training overriding the passive reception capacity. And her body geometry gives her a lower center of gravity that loads the outside foot naturally in the turn conversion. She paused. She's been underused. Cole said, I know. Do you? He looked at Ava. The question was direct and without apology, and it landed exactly where it was aimed. I'm in the process of revising an assessment, he said. Then revise it fast, Ava said. 3 weeks goes quickly and the mission doesn't care about process. She walked back toward the corridor. Cole stood where he was for a moment and watched her go, And then he looked across the yard at Mara Ellis, still at the turn, with her eyes closed, still working, still present, with a consistency and a focus that had been there every single day, and that he had been filing under competent, reliable standard, rather than looking at for what it actually was. He had a mission in 18 days. He had an operator he had been underestimating. The math on that was not comfortable. The afternoon session escalated in a direction none of the platoon had fully anticipated. Ava set 4 operators in the corridor simultaneously, not at the turn, but distributed along its length, 1 at entry, 1 at the mid-corridor, 1 at the turn, 1 at exit. The entering operator's job was to reach the exit. The 4 distributed operators had one constraint: eyes closed, no communication. The first run was Torres entering against Hackett, Reyes, Briggs, and a quiet veteran named Chen at the 4 positions. Torres made it to the mid-corridor position, was read, and stepped into by Reyes without any visual contact, and the 2 of them resolved the contact with a controlled stop that was technically clean but operationally complete. Torres did not reach the exit. The second run was Mara entering. She stood at the entry end of the corridor, and Cole watched her from the side and saw something he had not seen in 2 years of watching her train. He saw her choose. Not comply, not execute, not perform the function assigned to her. Choose. She set her feet, she breathed twice in the controlled pattern Ava had been teaching, and then she moved. She used the air. She varied her footfall weight at unpredictable intervals, not randomly but purposefully, creating a pressure signature that didn't match the commitment patterns the 4 operators had been trained in the past 3 days to read. Hackett at mid-corridor stepped 1 beat too early. Reyes at the turn loaded for a direction she'd been pointing toward and shifted out of at the last possible moment. Briggs at the exit position was the last line he was the most recently taught, the freshest calibration, still finding his way to passive reception rather than active analysis. Mara loaded her outside foot at the turn with the fluency of someone who had run it 60 times and converted it to instinct. She came around the corner at full unconverted speed, and her angle to Briggs was inside his red, not because he was wrong, but because she had changed her committed line twice in the last 4 feet of the approach, and the second change was the one that arrived. She passed him. She was at the exit. The corridor was silent. Cole said nothing. He was looking at Mara Ellis, standing at the exit end of the corridor with the focused, unsurprised expression of someone who had known what she was capable of for a very long time and had simply been waiting for a context in which it would be visible. Briggs opened his eyes. He turned and looked at the exit. He looked at Mara. He said, "She changed her line twice inside the last 4 feet." "Yes," Ava said. "That means she was controlling her own momentum signature, not just moving through the corridor, controlling what information the corridor gave me about where she was going." "Yes." Briggs looked at Mara, and what happened then was something that Cole registered with the particular attention he reserved for moments that changed the social architecture of a unit, because the social architecture of a unit was as operationally significant as any piece of tactical doctrine, and Cole knew this and managed it carefully. Briggs said to Mara directly, "How long have you been able to do that?" Mara looked at him. 2 years of being the person in the room that people spoke around, rather than to 2 years of performing at a ceiling that nobody had ever actually tested, 2 years of watching rooms decide what she was before she opened her mouth. She looked at Briggs and said, "I didn't know I could do that until 30 seconds ago." Briggs held her gaze. He said, "Run it again. I want to feel what that transition feels like from the defensive position." Mara ran it again. On the second run, Briggs caught the first line change. He did not catch the second. She was at the exit again. "Balshawayan," he said one more time. She ran it a third time. This time Briggs caught both changes and stepped into the second line correctly, and they met at the exit position with a clean, controlled contact that was the most technically precise thing that had happened in the corridor all day. Briggs said, "That's what the system does," in both directions simultaneously. "That's what the system does," Ava confirmed. Cole watched Mara Ellis walk back to the entry end of the corridor for the 4th run, and she walked differently than she had walked into the yard on the first morning. Not her posture, not her pace, something less visible than those things. She walked like someone who had been given back something that had always belonged to her. The session ran until 1700. By the end, 11 of the 12 operators had successfully read and intercepted a moving entry at least once from the closed-eye position. The 12th was Chen, who had a processing pattern that Ava had already identified and told Cole would resolve by day 6 with a specific adjustment to his paired drills. She was right about everything she predicted. Cole had started cataloging her predictions against outcomes because that was how he evaluated people, not by what they claimed, but by the accuracy ratio of their assessments over time. 3 days and her accuracy ratio was running at a level he had not seen in a training context. At the end of the session, she stood in the middle of the yard and looked at the group with the reading expression she'd worn since the first morning. She said, "I want to tell you something about what you did today, not to motivate you, just to make sure you understand what actually happened." The yard was still. "Every one of you in the past 3 hours operated successfully in an information-degraded environment using sensory channels you have not been trained to rely on. You did it without visual confirmation, without communication, without any of the active cognition protocols your training has spent years building." She paused. "That means the capacity was there. It has always been there. What I've been doing this week is not adding something new to your system. I've been removing the interference that was covering something that was already yours." Nobody said anything. Cole looked at his platoon at Briggs with his jaw set and his eyes clear at Hackett, already running the mechanics in his head, and at Torres, uncharacteristically still, at Mara Ellis with that new quality in her posture, and he felt something he did not experience often. He felt the particular irreplaceable sensation of a unit that is becoming more than it was. He had felt it twice before in 13 years. Both times it had made the difference when the difference was all that was left. He looked at Ava. She was looking at the corridor tape. Her expression was the one she wore when she was running calculations he couldn't see. He said, "What are you thinking?" She said, "I'm thinking about day 7. "Why day 7? "Because day 7 is when it starts to feel natural," she said. "And the moment it starts feeling natural is the moment the decision tree tries to take it back. The brain wants to categorize, systematize, convert passive reception into another active protocol. When that happens, most people regress." She looked at him. "I need you to watch for it. In your operators, when they start performing the system instead of inhabiting it." Cole said, "How do I tell the difference?" "Performing looks smooth," she said. "Inhabiting looks effortless. There's a difference. You'll feel it when you see it." He looked at her. "You're asking me to use passive reception to assess whether my operators are using passive reception." The corner of her mouth moved, just slightly. It was the closest thing to a smile he had seen from her in 3 days. "Yes," she said. He said, "That's either very elegant or very circular." "Both," she said. She picked up her bag. She walked toward the gate. She stopped at the threshold and turned around. "Senior Chief?" Cole looked at her. "Your platoon is ahead of schedule," she said. "That matters. 15 days left. Use them." She walked through the gate. Cole stood in the yard alone for the second time that week. And the light was the same low-angle late afternoon light, and the corridor tape was still on the floor, and 12 operators were walking to their vehicles with something in their bodies that hadn't been there 72 hours ago. He looked at the corridor, he looked at the turn. He thought about what was coming in 15 days, and what the geometry of that environment would ask of his operators, and for the first time since the orders arrived, he did not feel the weight of the unknown as something to be managed. He felt it as something to be prepared for. There was a difference. Ava Mercer had taught him that in 72 hours. He didn't want to think about how many years he'd been carrying the other version. Day 7 arrived the way Ava said it would. Cole noticed it in the first 20 minutes of the morning session. The movements were cleaner. The corridor runs were faster. The paired reception drills had a fluency that hadn't been there 48 hours earlier. And on the surface, if you were watching with the eye of someone who didn't know what to look for, you would have called it progress. You would have said the platoon was ahead of schedule and left it at that. Cole didn't leave it at that. He watched Torres run the corridor and felt something slightly wrong in the quality of the movement. Not the mechanics. The mechanics were good, but the energy behind them had a performed quality, a smoothness that was too intentional to be genuine reception. Torres was executing a protocol. He was doing it well. But he was executing, not inhabiting, and Cole felt the difference in his chest before he had language for it, which meant Ava's instruction from 3 days ago had already taken root in him more deeply than he'd realized. He said nothing yet. He watched. Briggs ran the paired drill with Hackett, and hit his position correctly on the first attempt, and then looked up immediately after to check whether Ava had seen it. That look, that fraction of a second performance check, told Cole everything. Briggs was monitoring his own execution and evaluating it against an external standard. That was active cognition. That was the decision tree wearing the system's clothes. Cole walked to where Ava was standing at the yard's edge. Day 7, he said. You see it, she said. It wasn't a question. Torres is performing, Briggs is monitoring. Hackett is the only one fully in it right now, she said. And Ellis, watch Ellis. Cole looked across the yard to where Mara was running a solo quarter pass. No paired opposition, just herself and the tape in the turn. She moved through it with a quality that was different from everyone else's movement that morning. Not cleaner, not technically superior in any visible way, but quieter. Her body wasn't announcing itself. It was just moving the way water moves without commentary. Cole watched it and felt the distinction Ava had named land in him with a clarity that was almost physical. She's not thinking about it, he said. She stopped thinking about it on day 5, Ava said. She's the only one who did it that fast. Cole looked at Mara for another moment. Then he said, what do we do about the others? We break the pattern, Ava said. We introduce a variable they can't perform their way through. She walked to the center of the yard. She said loudly enough for the full group, stop, everyone out of the quarter, leave your positions. The platoon gathered. Cole moved to the edge of the cluster, his standard position present, but not between the instructor and the group. Ava looked at them steadily. Some of you are performing the system this morning. You know who you are. Your movements are correct. Your timing is close. But you're watching yourself do it, which means you're half a second behind where you need to be, because half your processing is being used to evaluate your own performance rather than receive information from the environment. The yard was quiet. Torres said without defensiveness, I didn't know I was doing it. That's the point, Ava said. Day 7 is when the brain tries to take back control by converting what you've learned into another active protocol. It feels like mastery. It isn't mastery. It's the decision tree in a new outfit. She looked at the group. So we're going to do something today that the decision tree cannot dress up. We're going to do something that requires you to fail in order to succeed. Briggs said, that's not a sentence that has ever been said in this yard before. I know, Ava said. She reached into her bag and produced a set of noise-attenuating earplugs. She held them up. Corridor runs with full audio attenuation. You cannot hear your opponent. You cannot hear your own footfall clearly. You are operating on vibration, air, and instinct alone. She looked at the group. The decision tree has nothing to work with. There is no audio data to categorize. There is no performance to monitor because you cannot hear yourself perform. Torres looked at the earplugs. He said, I'm either going to love this or it's going to be the worst experience of my life. Probably both, Hackett said. The earplugs went in. Cole put his own in because this was not a session he was going to observe from the outside. Something had shifted in him over the past 7 days that he was still in the process of naming a reorientation of his relationship to his own training, to his own command, to the question of what it meant to know something versus what it meant to have categorized it. He put the earplugs in and felt the world narrow to vibration and pressure, and the faint sound of his own blood moving, and he walked to the start of the corridor and waited. Hackett entered from the far end. Cole closed his eyes. He breathed. He let the decision tree go as quiet as 13 years of grooved reflex would allow, which was not entirely quiet, but was quieter than it had been on day 3, and he stood at the turn and received. He felt the floor before he heard anything. A low-frequency pressure transfer through the training mat, not a sound, a fact traveling up through his feet and into his legs with the specific signature of a 190-pound man loading his outside foot 12 feet from the turn. Cole read the direction from the pressure, not the sound, and stepped into the committed line 2 full beats before Hackett arrived. He was in the right place. Hackett's shoulder connected with his chest, and they both went still. And Cole opened his eyes and found Hackett already looking at him with an expression of precise, contained astonishment. Hackett pulled his earplug out and said, You read the floor. Yes, Cole said. Floor vibration gives you direction. Weight transfer onto the outside foot tells you which way the momentum is committed. The floor just carries the information faster than the air does. Hackett stood still for this moment, running this through his internal mechanics catalog. Then he said, That's why she said vibration, not as an alternative to air displacement, as a faster channel. Layered inputs, Cole said, all arriving at different speeds. You stack them. Hackett looked at the corridor with an expression that Cole recognized as the one that preceded Hackett, understanding something completely the particular stillness before the full mechanical picture assembled. He said, the system isn't about any single sensory channel. It's about parallel processing of multiple low-resolution inputs to build a real-time composite picture faster than any single high-resolution input could provide. Cole said, say that again in English. 5 blurry pictures at once are faster than one perfect picture, Hackett said. Your brain can assemble a directional read from 5 partial signals faster than it can wait for a single clear signal to complete. Cole looked at him. Then he looked at Ava, who was standing at the entry end of the corridor and who had clearly heard the exchange, and whose expression had shifted almost imperceptibly, a slight tightening around the eyes that was Cole, had learned in 7 days the equivalent of a standing ovation from Ava Mercer. He said to Hackett, tell the group that, word for word, after the session. Roger that, Hackett said. The earplug drill ran for 90 minutes. By the end of the first 30, the performance issue had resolved itself the way Ava said it would not, through instruction, but through necessity. With audio attenuation, there was nothing to perform against. The monitoring loop had no data to monitor. Torres stopped checking himself and started receiving, and his corridor accuracy jumped from 60% to 83% in 20 minutes. Briggs stopped looking up after each run because there was nothing to see that would tell him whether he'd done it correctly, only the physical confirmation of contact or its absence. By the end of 90 minutes, 11 operators were running clean reads on better than 70% of entries. The 12th was Chen, who Ava had identified on day 3 as having a specific processing pattern that needed individual adjustment. She pulled him aside during a water break and worked with him one-on-one for 12 minutes with a hand on his shoulder blade, talking quietly. And when he returned to the corridor, his read rate was 68%, which Ava told Cole afterward was exactly where it needed to be at this stage of his individual curve. Cole said, you tracked his individual curve from day 3. I track everyone's individual curve, she said. The group training is real, but the group training is scaffolding. The actual work is 12 individual adjustments happening simultaneously. Cole looked at her. You're running 12 different sessions in parallel. I'm running 12 different sessions and monitoring the group architecture at the same time, she said, because the group architecture affects the individual sessions. If Briggs resolves before Torres uses Briggs's resolution as an external benchmark and starts performing against it. If Mara advances too visibly ahead of the group, some of the men will adjust their effort downward to maintain the relative position they were comfortable with. Cole felt something tighten in his chest. Has that happened? Not significantly, she said. Your platoon is better than most, but I've been managing the visibility of individual progress carefully to prevent it. Cole stood with that for a moment. He was thinking about the 12 sessions she was running in parallel and about the 3 days of advanced prediction he'd watched her deliver with accuracy that he'd never seen matched, and about the question he'd been sitting on since the first morning in the early light. He said, where did you build this system? Ava looked at him. She held his gaze for a long moment with the expression that he had learned meant she was deciding how much to give. She said, I built it out of what didn't work. He waited. I was in a confined engagement at 22, she said. Multi-turn corridor 4. Contacts partial visibility, high ambient noise. Everything I'd been trained to do in that environment failed because the geometry made it fail. Strength-based response in a 6-foot corridor against 4 contacts who know you're coming is not a solvable problem with strength-based tools. She paused. I solved it a different way. Afterward, I spent 18 months understanding exactly what I'd done and why it worked and how to teach it. Cole said, what happened in the engagement? It wasn't a question about the outcome. It was a question about the question. Ava said everyone came home. Cole nodded. But it was close, she said. Closer than it should have been. Closer than it would have been if I'd had 3 weeks of this before I walked into that corridor. She looked at the yard. That's why I'm here. Not because Warcom decided to innovate, because someone in the chain read my after-action report and understood what it meant. Cole was quiet for a moment, then he said, I'm glad they did. Ava looked at him. It was a direct statement without qualification or command speak. and it landed in the space between them with the specific weight of something genuinely meant. She received it the way she received everything, without performance, without deflection. She said, 15 days left. Let's not waste them. The afternoon brought the twist that Cole had not anticipated. Ava changed the corridor. She had the tape pulled and relayed in a configuration that none of them had seen: 2 turns instead of 1, the first at the 12-foot mark, the second at the 20-foot mark, the total length extended to 32 feet. Different angles at each turn, one tighter than the standard, one wider. The wider turn was the trap, because the wider turn created an instinct to accelerate through it. An acceleration through a wide turn in a real confined space was the single most exploitable predictability pattern in the system. She didn't explain any of this before she ran Torres through it. Torres entered, moved well to the first turn, hit the tight angle cleanly. His footwork had been good for 2 days, and then at the wide turn, he accelerated exactly as the geometry invited. And Reyes, positioned at the exit, read the acceleration and stepped into his committed line with a precision that stopped Torres 3 feet short of the exit. Torres stood where he was stopped and said, "What happened?" "Wide turn," Ava said. "Your speed increased by approximately 15%. That increase is a commitment signature that reads louder than anything else in the corridor." Torres looked at the tape on the floor. He looked at the wide turn specifically. "I didn't know I sped up." "That's why the wide turn is more dangerous than the tight turn," Ava said. "The tight turn triggers conscious caution. The wide turn feels like relief, and relief makes you loud." Torres said slowly, "So the turn that feels safe is the one that kills you." "In this geometry, yes," she said. "The geometry your mission is running in has 2 of them." The yard went very still. Cole heard it. He heard every operator in the group hear it simultaneously, the confirmation that this was not abstract training, that the 2-turn corridor on the floor was not a pedagogical escalation, but a direct replica of an environment that was waiting for them in 18 days. Hackett said, "You've seen the mission space." Ava said, "I've seen the geometry descriptor." "That's enough." Cole said, "Who gave you the descriptor?" Ava looked at him. "The same people who sent you the orders?" Cole held her gaze for exactly 3 seconds. Then he said, "All right." And he walked to the entry end of the corridor and ran it himself. He hit the first turn cleanly. He felt the wide turn coming and felt the relief geometry that Ava had named the subtle invitation to accelerate, that the wider angle created. And he fought the instinct consciously, which was wrong, because fighting it consciously made him decelerate instead. And deceleration at the wide turn was its own commitment, signature, slower and more complete than acceleration, but equally readable. Briggs, at the exit position, stepped into his line before he arrived. Cole stopped. He stood in the corridor between the 2 turns and said to the air in front of him, "I overcorrected." "Yes," Ava said from outside the tape. "Conscious resistance to acceleration creates deceleration. Deceleration is also a commitment signature." "Everything is a commitment signature," she said. "Acceleration, deceleration, hesitation, pause. Every deviation from constant momentum tells the person receiving that information exactly where you are in your decision cycle." Cole said, "So the answer is constant momentum through the wide turn." "Converted momentum," she said. "Not constant speed, constant energy state. The speed can change. The energy commitment cannot." Cole stood in the corridor and ran the mechanical picture through his mind. Constant energy state through the wide turn meant the same principle as the tight turn, outside foot load, momentum conversion using the geometry rather than fighting it or yielding to it, but applied to a wider angle, which meant the conversion was subtler, less dramatic, easier to miss, easier to perform correctly and still have the energy signature slightly off. He said, "This takes longer to develop than the tight turn. 3 more days for the tight turn to become fully instinctive," she said. 5 more days for the wide turn after that, which puts us at day 15. She paused. "That leaves 6 days for integrated runs at full corridor length with full opposition." Cole stepped out of the corridor. He looked at his platoon. He looked at 18 days and 6 days and the math between them. He said, "We run evenings." Ava looked at him. "We extend the sessions," he said, "not to compensate, to consolidate. The instinct development doesn't need more instruction. It needs more repetition in the time we have." She said, "That's your call." "I know," he said. "We run evenings." Briggs said from his position at the corridor exit. "I'm in." Torres said, "Same." Hackett said nothing, which meant yes. Mara Ellis said from the left side of the yard, where she'd been running the two-turn corridor solo during the discussion. "I've been in for 6 days, just catching up on the announcement." Several of the men laughed, real laughter, the kind that comes from genuine surprise from a room discovering that the quietest person has been several steps ahead of the conversation. Cole looked at Mara. She was standing at the exit end of the two-turn corridor, with her weight evenly distributed and her expression the same focused calm she'd carried since the first morning. And he thought about what Ava had said. She's been in since day 5. She's the only one who did it that fast. And he thought about 2 years of evaluations and what they had and had not captured. He said, "Ellis." She looked at him. "You're running the wide turn integration drills with me this afternoon." She blinked once, not with surprise, with recognition. The recognition of someone who has been waiting for a thing to be said and is processing the fact that it's finally being said. "Yes, Senior Chief," she said. Cole turned to Ava. "Run it." The afternoon session lasted 4 hours. By the end of it, the two-turn corridor had been run 347 times by 12 operators in various configurations. The wide turn was still producing commitment signature errors on approximately 40% of entries, which Ava told Cole was exactly the expected error rate at day 7 of a 15-day instinct development cycle. She was running the numbers in real time. Cole had stopped being surprised by this. What surprised him was what happened at 16:30 in the last 30 minutes of the session. Ava had been running the platoon through full opposition corridor drills, 2 operators entering, 3 defending full audio attenuation two-turn configuration, and the entries had been going roughly as the day's data predicted. Then she stopped the drill and said, "Mara, enter solo, full opposition, 5 defenders." The yard went quiet. 5 defenders was more than the number they'd used for the 4-operator simultaneous drill in part 2. 5 defenders in a two-turn corridor of 32 feet meant 1 at entry, 1 at the first turn, 1 between turns, 1 at the second turn, 1 at the exit. Full coverage. No gap in the defensive architecture. Cole said carefully, "Ava." She looked at him. He said, "That's a significant escalation." "I know," she said. "Is it appropriate for day 7? She said, "For 11 of the 12 operators, no. For this one, yes." Cole looked at Mara. Mara was looking at the corridor with the focused, quiet attention of someone reading a problem rather than feeling intimidated by it. She was not performing confidence. She was not demonstrating anything. She was just looking at the corridor the way Ava looked at problems, as geometry, as information, as a set of principles waiting to be applied. Cole stepped back. The 5 defenders took their positions. Briggs at the entry, Chen at the first turn, Reyes between turns, Hackett at the second turn, Torres at the exit. Torres specifically at the exit because Torres's red rate had been the highest in the group for 2 days running, and this was not a moment for a weak final position. Mara stood at the entry end. She breathed twice. She looked at the corridor. She moved. What happened in the next 53 seconds was something Cole would spend the rest of his career trying to articulate accurately and never quite managing to, because the language available to him for physical events was built for events that followed the mechanical logic his training had developed, and what Mara Ellis did in that corridor did not follow that logic. She didn't enter fast. She entered at a pace that was 2/3 of her normal quarter speed, which immediately created a problem for Briggs at the entry position because his read of her commitment signature was calibrated to a speed range that her current pace didn't fit. He stepped into a line she wasn't on. She was past him before the correction was possible. Chen at the first turn was set for the tight angle entry pattern. She varied her outside foot load timing by a single beat earlier than the corridor geometry suggested loading, before the instinct would predict, and the energy signature she gave the floor was half a step ahead of where Chen was reading. He stepped into where she was going to be. She was already somewhere else. Between the turns, she did something none of the watching operators could name immediately. She did not decelerate. She did not accelerate. She changed the character of her movement without changing its speed, a quality shift rather than a quantity shift. the momentum converting through a micro-adjustment in her hip angle that redirected the floor signature without altering the air signature. Reyes reading air felt one thing. The floor told him something else. The conflict between the two inputs created a half-second processing gap. Half a second was the whole game. She was at the wide turn. Hackett was at the wide turn. Of the 5 defenders, Hackett was the most dangerous because Hackett had been the fastest to develop parallel input processing and was running the full composite picture, air floor breath pressure, simultaneously. He was the hardest read in the platoon to fool. Mara didn't fool him. She did something more sophisticated than fooling him. She gave him accurate information, real commitment, signature, real momentum, direction, real outside footload for the wrong turn. She committed fully to a left side exit from the wide turn, gave him every real signal that the left exit was where she was going, and then at the very last geometrically possible moment, she used the wide turn's stored energy, the way Ava had described it, not to change direction, but to change which part of her body arrived first. Her shoulder rotated inside Hackett's blocking arm, her hip converted the turn's energy into a rightward continuation, and she came out of the wide turn's right side with Hackett's arm behind her rather than in front. He didn't fall. He didn't fail catastrophically. He simply found himself in the correct position for the person he had expected, and the person who actually came through was 6 inches to his right. 6 inches in a 32-foot corridor at the wide turn in the last 10 feet before the exit. Torres was at the exit. He had been watching. He had the best read rate in the platoon. He was set. She came at him at the same 2/3 speed she'd entered, with which was still wrong for Torres's calibration, and she hit the outside footload early. Again, the same timing the variation she'd used on Chen and Torres stepped for the right line, but the pace was off, and she was through the contact point before his body weight had fully committed. She was at the exit. The corridor was silent. 53 seconds. 5 defenders, 12 years of combined operational experience between them. And Mara Ellis, who had known she could do this for approximately 7 days, stood at the exit end of the corridor and breathed with the even controlled cadence Ava had been teaching since the first morning. Nobody said anything for what felt like a long time. Then Hackett said to the corridor wall rather than to anyone in particular, "She gave me real data for the wrong outcome." "Yes," Ava said. "She didn't fake the signals. She committed genuinely to a direction and then changed which part of her body followed the commitment." "Yes." "That's not a technique," Hackett said slowly. "That's a principle. You can apply it to any commitment geometry." "That's what the system is," Ava said. "A principle, not a technique. Techniques are cataloged and countered. Principles are alive." Briggs was looking at Mara Ellis with an expression that Cole had never seen on him in 2 years of commanding them together. It was the expression of a man encountering genuine respect, not the professional acknowledgement of a superior's assessment, not the competitive recognition of a worthy opponent, but the specific unguarded respect that a person feels when they see another person do something that reorders their understanding of what's possible. Briggs said, "Ellis." Mara looked at him. He said, "That was the best thing I've seen in this yard, and I've been in this yard for 8 years. Mara held his gaze for a moment. She said, "I learned it from the same person you did." Briggs said, "Yeah." He looked at Ava, "But you ran it first." Cole stood at the side of the yard and felt the architecture of his platoon shifting in real time. Not the social architecture, which had been shifting for 7 days, but the operational architecture, the internal map of who could do what and how and at what cost. That map was his primary command instrument. He had been rewriting it for a week. The rewrite was accelerating. He looked at Ava. She was watching the corridor. She was running numbers. Her expression was the calculation expression, and Cole had learned by now that when she wore that expression, the output was worth waiting for. He walked over to her and stood beside her and waited. She said without looking at him, 11 days. 11 days, he confirmed. The wide turn instinct will consolidate in 5, she said. That leaves 6 for integrated full corridor opposition runs. 6 days is enough. She paused. If nothing changes. Cole looked at her. What would change it? She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, regression, overconfidence, the system breaking down under competitive pressure when the operators start running full opposition and ego re-engages. She looked at him. The transition from individual instinct development to team application is where most programs lose the work they built. The operators start performing for each other again. The decision trees come back. Everything from week one has to be relearned in the context of team dynamics. Cole said, "How do we prevent it?" She said, "We don't prevent it, we manage it. You manage it. That's the command function I can't do for you." She looked at him directly. "When it starts happening, and it will start happening, probably day 9 or 10, I need you inside the drill, not observing from the side. Your presence in the corridor changes the social architecture. Your operators will not perform for you the way they perform for each other. They know you too well." Cole held her gaze. He said, "You want me to be the variable that breaks the performance loop." "I want you to be the standard," she said, "not the observer, the standard." Cole was quiet for a moment. 13 years of command had built in him a very clear architecture for the relationship between a commander and a training environment: present, observing, assessing, directing. He managed from the edge of the yard because that was where command happened. The center of the yard was for operators. Ava was asking him to give up the edge. He said, "If I'm inside the drill, who's reading the group?" "I am," she said. He looked at her. He thought about the accuracy ratio he'd been tracking for 7 days. He thought about 12 individual learning curves being managed simultaneously. He thought about the mission descriptor and the wide turn and what his platoon needed to be in 11 days. He said, "All right." She nodded. Cole looked at the corridor. He looked at his platoon, at Briggs and Hackett and Torres and Reyes and Chen and Mara Ellis. All of them in various conversations, the energy of the yard carrying the specific quality of a group that has done something together that they didn't know they could do. He thought about Mara's 53 seconds. He thought about what Ava had said on the first morning: the most dangerous enemy in the next mission will not be outside the corridor. He was beginning to understand what she meant. Not abstractly, not as doctrine. In the bones, the way you understand a thing when the thing has happened in front of you and you've felt it move through the group you're responsible for. The understanding that his platoon's greatest operational liability was not their opponent's strength. It was his platoon's own instinct, the groove-trained, reliable, deeply trusted instinct that had kept them alive in 100 environments and would, in this specific geometry, predict them. Make them readable. Turn their excellence into a pattern that a prepared opponent could step into the way Ava had stepped into Briggs's forward drive on the very first morning. 11 days. The corridor was waiting. So was whatever was on the other end of the mission package. Cole Maddox picked up his gear and walked to the entry end of the corridor and said to whoever was listening, "Again, full opposition. I'm entering." Nobody had to be told twice. Day 11 came in hard. Cole was in the corridor before anyone else arrived. Not observing, entering. He had been entering every session since the afternoon of day 7, when he told Ava he'd give up the edge, and the decision had cost him something. He hadn't fully anticipated the particular discomfort of a commander who discovers by placing himself inside the work that his own patterns are more visible than he believed. He had been predictable. Not badly, not in ways that would have gotten his people killed in a standard engagement. But by Ava's standard, by the standard of the geometry that was waiting for them in 7 days, he had been readable. His entries carried a consistency of pace that a prepared opponent could time. His wide turn conversion was clean, but it was clean the same way every time, which meant it was a signature rather than a solution. Briggs had stepped into his line correctly on 6 of the last 8 entries. Hackett had caught him on 4. Cole had not said anything about this to anyone. He had run it at night in his rack, analyzing his own patterns with the same instrument he used to analyze everyone else's, and the picture was not comfortable. He was 41 years old, 13 years of command, 2 decades of training that had built his instincts into something reliable and fast and effective, and in the corridor geometry that was coming partially wrong. He ran the 2-turn corridor alone in the empty yard and felt the wide turn and felt the pull toward the same conversion he always made, the same hip angle, the same outside foot of timing, and he fought the fight that all of them had been fighting for 11 days, the fight between the instinct that had kept him alive and the principle that would keep him and his people alive in what was coming. By the time Ava walked through the gate at 0540, he had run it 21 times. He had varied the conversion on 9 of them. 5 of the 9 were genuinely different. 4 were different in execution, but identical in energy signature, which was worse than being consistent because Inconsistency of form with consistency of feel was the hardest pattern to break. Iva walked to the edge of the corridor and watched him without speaking. He ran at a 20-second time. He came out of the wide turn and stopped and said without turning around, "4 of my variations are fake." "Yes," she said. "Same energy signature with different footwork. The footwork change is conscious. The energy signature is still running on the original instinct." She walked toward him. "You're doing what Briggs did on day 7. You're performing a variation." Cole turned around. He said, "How do I fix it?" She said, "Stop trying to vary it. Stop trying to do anything different. Run the corridor thinking about nothing except what the floor is telling you." He looked at her. "That's the same instruction you gave Briggs." "It's the same problem," she said. "The problem doesn't care about rank." Cole stood with that for a moment. Then he said, "When did you know I had this pattern?" "Day 8, she said. "You didn't say anything. You needed to find it yourself. If I'd named it, you'd have executed a fix. Executing a fix doesn't resolve the instinct. It just adds a layer on top of it." She looked at him steadily. "You found it yourself. That means the resolution will be real." Cole looked at the corridor. He thought about 7 days. He thought about the mission package and the geometry and what the stakes were for the 12 people he was responsible for, and what it meant that his own instinct was still partially running the old protocol beneath the new one. He said, "I have 7 days." "You have 7 days," she said. "So do they." The platoon arrived at 06:30, and the session that followed was the hardest of the 3 weeks. Not physically, the physical demands had been consistent, but cognitively, because Ava had designed day 11 as the first full integration test, full team, full quarter, full opposition, full audio attenuation, and the social architecture variable she had warned Cole about had arrived exactly on schedule. Briggs entered first against a 5-man defense and hit the wide turn with a conversion that was technically correct and socially performed. He was running for the group's assessment, not for the corridor's information, and Hackett caught him at the wide turn exit with a red that was almost contemptuous in its accuracy. Briggs stepped out and his jaw was tight. Torres entered second and made it to the second turn before Reyes caught him, and Torres's response to the catch was to laugh, which was fine and genuine, but the laugh was also the sound of someone releasing pressure that had been building because they were performing, and performing creates pressure in a way that inhabiting does not. Mara entered third. She was at the exit in 48 seconds. Mute defenders, full opposition, 5 seconds faster than her day 7 run. She came out and nobody laughed and nobody cheered. The yard simply went quiet with the quality of quiet that falls when something is witnessed rather than watched. Briggs was looking at her with his arms at his sides and his expression fully open, all the performance gone out of it, and Cole, standing at the entry end, felt the social architecture of his platoon shift one more time. Not away from something, but towards something. Toward a reckoning with what was actually real in this yard versus what they had been telling themselves was real for years. Cole said, "Everyone out of the corridor, sit down." It was not a command tone. It was the tone of a man who has something to say that requires stillness to receive. The platoon settled. Ava stood at the yard's edge. Cole stood in the center, which was not where he usually stood, and the fact that he was not at the edge was itself a communication that every operator in the group registered without being told to. Cole said, "I want to talk about what's been happening in this yard for 11 days. Not the technique, not the system, the real thing underneath it." Nobody moved. "I've been running this yard for 8 years, he said. "Before this yard, there was another yard. Before that deployment. Before that training that built everything I know about how force works and how operators perform and what the difference is between a good operator and a great one." He paused. "I thought I knew that difference. I thought it was speed, strength, experience, decision quality under pressure. Those things are real. I'm not taking them back." He looked at his platoon. "But there is a category of performance that I had not included in my model, and Mara Ellis has been in that category for 2 years, while I was not looking at the right metric." The yard was absolutely still. Mara was looking at him with an expression he had not seen on her face in 2 years. Not gratitude, not relief. Something more complicated than those things, the expression of a person receiving an acknowledgement that they stopped expecting and had therefore stopped preparing for. Cole said, "That's on me, and I'm naming it out loud in front of this platoon because the mission we are going into in 7 days does not accommodate blind spots. Mine or anyone else's? He looked at Mara directly. You're the most naturally equipped operator in this platoon for the environment we're heading into. That changes how we build the team structure for the integrated runs this week. Briggs said quietly, it should change the mission structure too. Cole looked at him. Briggs said, she should be running the first entry on the primary corridor. Not because she's better, because her instinct is calibrated for this geometry in a way that took the rest of us 11 days to approximate, and she arrived at in 5. He paused. You put your best tool in the hardest position. That's what you've always told us. Cole held Briggs's gaze for a long moment. Marcus Briggs, who had laughed at the gate on the first morning, who had been thrown on his back in under 2 seconds, who had said, I think I'm in on the second day, and had meant it with every piece of his considerable ego available, that Marcus Briggs was now standing in front of his senior chief in his platoon and making an operational argument for a structural change that reduced his own role in the primary engagement sequence. Cole said noted. He looked at Ava. She was looking at him with the expression she wore when the right answer had been arrived at by the right people in the right way. He said, 7 days, let's build the mission structure. The next 4 days were the most compressed, most demanding, most operationally precise training Cole had run in 8 years in the yard. Ava restructured the sessions around mission-specific geometry, the exact corridor dimensions from the descriptor, the 2-turn configuration, the noise and visibility conditions described in the brief, the specific defensive deployment patterns that the intelligence suggested they would encounter. She ran them in pairs, then threes, then full team entries. She ran them at 0-400 in simulated low-light conditions, hands on the corridor wall, no visual reference at all. She ran them in sequence entry, team support, team, exfil, team, and she ran the sequences back-to-back with 30-second transition windows until the sequences were not procedures but reflexes. Cole ran every session inside the quarter. Ava had said she would read the group, and she did. He could see her tracking every operator's integration curve from the yard's edge with an attention that was so comprehensive and so quiet that it was easy to forget she was doing it until she would stop a drill and make a correction so precise and so individually targeted that it felt less like instruction and more like she had been reading their interior states. On day 13, she stopped Chen mid-entry and said, your wide turn timing shifted by 0.3 of a second. You're fatiguing in the hip flexor on the right side. Ice tonight 10 minutes before sleep. Chen blinked. How did you floor signature? She said. Your load timing changes when that muscle is fatigued. 0.3 is enough to make your read predictable to a prepared defender. She looked at him. Ice tonight. Chen said, yes, ma'am. Hackett, running from the entry end, said quietly to Torres, she's reading us physiologically now. Torres said, she's been reading us physiologically since day 1. We just didn't know it. On day 14, Cole had his breakthrough. He had been working in the wide turn variation for 7 days. The execution variations were clean. The energy signature was still partially consistent. He could feel it the way you feel a word that's almost right but not quite the specific dissatisfaction of a solution that's correct in form but not in substance. He had run it 240 times in 2 weeks. He had understood it intellectually since day 8. He had not inhabited it. On day 14, in the 4th session of the day, he entered the corridor at a speed that was different from his usual pace. Not deliberately different, differently different. The kind of change that happens when a body has been doing something for long enough that it stops asking the mind for permission. He hit the wide turn, and the outside foot loaded at a timing that he had not planned and had not practiced. A timing that emerged from the floor's information rather than from his mental calculation of what the floor's information should produce, and he came out of the wide turn at an angle that was genuinely new. Not a variation of his standard angle, but a departure from it, generated by the corridor's own geometry in real time. Briggs at the exit position did not catch him. Cole stopped at the exit. He stood still for a moment. Briggs said from behind him, what did you do at the wide turn? Cole said, I don't know. Briggs said, Cole, I don't know yet. Give me a second. He stood at the exit and felt backward through the movement, the way you retrace a path you walked in the dark. The outside foot had loaded earlier than his practiced timing, a full half beat earlier than any of his deliberate variations. The energy at the turn had converted at an angle he'd never consciously targeted. The exit had come from a line that his standard entry pattern would never have produced. He said, "The floor told me something at the first turn that changed my angle for the second turn." Aviva said from the yard's edge, "Yes. The two turns are communicating," he said. "The energy signature from the first turn generates a momentum vector that feeds into the wide turn if you let it. I've been treating them as separate problems." "They're one problem," she said. "The corridor is one problem. You've been running two problems in sequence." Cole stood at the exit end and felt the entirety of 3 weeks reorganize itself around that single statement. "The corridor is one problem." He said to Briggs, "Run it." Briggs ran it. He came out of the wide turn at his standard angle. Cole stepped into it correctly from the exit position, and Briggs stopped, and they stood there in the corridor with the recognition passing between them of two men who have just confirmed an understanding that doesn't need to be spoken at length. Briggs said, "The two turns feed each other." "If you let them," Cole said. Briggs said, "I've been resetting between turns." "We all have," Cole said. "That's what we're going to fix today." He walked out of the corridor and stood in front of his platoon and said, "The two-turn corridor is not two problems. It's one problem. Every reset between turns is giving a prepared defender information about your decision state. The reset is a commitment signature. Eliminate the reset." The platoon looked at him. Hackett said, "How do you eliminate a reset that's happening below conscious level?" Cole said, "The same way you eliminate the break at the tight turn. You run it until the corridor is one thing instead of two things. Your body already knows how to do it. You just have to stop interrupting the sequence." He looked at Ava. She was looking at him with the expression she had worn when Hackett said 5 blurry pictures are faster than 1 perfect picture. The expression of someone receiving the right answer from the right person. She said, "Run it." They ran it for 4 hours. By the end of the first hour, 7 of the 12 operators had experienced at least one run where the corridor was one problem, where the tight turn generated information that the wide turn received without interruption, where the momentum from entry to exit was genuinely continuous rather than reset and reapplied at each transition point. By the end of the third hour, 11 operators were hitting it on better than half their runs. Mara Ellis ran it clean on every attempt from the 40-minute mark forward. The 12th was Briggs. Cole watched Briggs run the corridor 12 times in the 4th hour with the expression of a man who understands exactly what he's trying to do and cannot yet stop his body from doing what it has always done instead. The reset was deeply grooved in him, 8 years of breach training, of treating each obstacle as a discrete problem to be solved in sequence of resetting between variables, because the cognitive architecture of his training demanded it. Cole walked to the corridor entry and stood next to Briggs. He said, "Tell me what the first turn feels like." Briggs said, "It feels like a solution. I hit it, it works, and then I reset to assess the next problem." "The first turn isn't a solution," Cole said. "It's the beginning of the solution. The wide turn is the middle. The exit is the end. You've been treating each one as its own sentence. They're one sentence." Briggs looked at the corridor. He said, 13 years, Cole." "I know," Cole said. "I had 14 years when I found the same thing 2 hours ago." Briggs looked at him. Cole said, "You felt it once on day 3. The floor through your boots. You said it out loud. That's the whole sentence. Start there. Start every run at that feeling and let the corridor complete itself." Briggs was quiet for a moment. Then he walked to the entry end of the corridor. He stood still. He breathed. He did not look at the corridor. He looked at his feet, specifically at the floor beneath his feet, and Cole understood what he was doing. He was going back to the beginning, to the first real thing he'd felt in this system, the floor vibration through his boots, on the day the decision tree went quiet for the first time. He moved. Cole watched from outside the tape. The first turn was clean, not unusually clean, just Briggs, clean the way it always was. But then, and Cole felt it before he could see, it felt it in the quality of the movement. The absence of the half-beat pause, the reset did not happen. Briggs carried the momentum from the tight turn directly into his approach for the wide turn, and the wide turn received the energy from the first turn, the way the corridor geometry was designed to transfer it. And he came out the wide turn at an angle that was not his standard angle, that was not any of his practiced variations, that was generated by the corridor itself, rather than by Briggs's calculation of what the corridor required. Mara at the exit position stepped into his committed line, but she stepped into it one beat late. Briggs's shoulder hit the center of her chest rather than her side. Not a miss, a partial read, a read that was right in a direction and wrong in timing, because the angle Briggs had produced was new enough that even Mara's calibration had required a fraction of a second's additional processing. Briggs stopped. He stood at the exit. Mara said, "I was late." Briggs turned around slowly. His expression was the one from the yard on the first day when he'd said, "I think I'm in, but cleaner now," stripped of the ego-adjacent quality that had still been present in that moment, just the raw fact of a man who has just done something for the first time and knows it. He said, "The corridor is one sentence." Cole said, "Yes." Briggs said, "And the sentence tells you things about itself as you're running it." "Yes." "And the things it tells you change what the end of the sentence is." Cole said, "That's the whole system." Briggs stood at the exit end of the corridor and looked at the tape on the floor, and looked at Mara and looked at Cole, and then he looked at Ava, who was standing at the yard's edge, where she had stood for 3 weeks, and he said simply, and without any of the performance that had characterized the first 2 days of her presence, "She's right, this works." Not, "I think I'm in." "She's right, this works." The difference between those two sentences was 3 weeks. It was the difference between a man standing at the edge of something and a man who had walked all the way through it and arrived at the other side knowing what he now carried. Cole looked at his platoon, 12 operators in various states of physical fatigue and cognitive expansion, standing in a yard that had been a different yard 3 weeks ago. Not a different physical space, the same tape, the same mats, the same morning light, but a different yard in the only way that mattered, which was the way the people in it understood themselves and each other and the work they were preparing to do. He looked at Ava. She was looking at the corridor. The calculation expression was gone. What was there instead was something he'd seen only once before, on her face briefly on the morning of day 7, when he'd told her he couldn't identify the technique, and she'd said that was the first useful thing he'd told her. Something that was not quite satisfaction and not quite relief, but lived in the same vicinity as both. He walked to where she was standing. He said, "We're ready." She looked at him. She said, "Tell me why." Cole said, "Because the system isn't in their heads anymore. It's in their bodies. When the corridor is real and the noise is real and the visibility is gone and the decision tree is firing on everything it has, the system will still be there underneath it. Because we didn't learn it. We built it." He paused. "And because the most dangerous thing going into that corridor in 6 days is not going to be what's waiting inside. It's going to be their own instincts trying to take the wheel at the worst possible moment. And they know that now. They'll feel it when it happens, and they'll know what to do." Ava was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Yes, you're ready." Cole nodded. He turned to face his platoon. He said, "One more run, everyone in the corridor. Full team entry, full opposition, full attenuation. We run it once more as everything we've built, and then we close the session." He paused. Mara leads the entry. Nobody reacted with surprise. Nobody looked at each other to calibrate their response. The platoon simply organized itself around the statement the way water organizes around a new channel, finding the shape without resistance, without commentary, because the shape was right, and they all knew it. Mara walked to the entry end of the corridor. The defenders took their positions. Cole was the last at the exit because that was right too, not as a test of her, but as a statement about what command looked like when it was working correctly. The most experienced person in the yard at the position that required the most complete and accurate read, and the person who had demonstrated the fullest integration of the system running the entry that was the hardest and most consequential. The yard went quiet. Mara breathed once. She looked at the corridor. She moved. 41 seconds. The corridor was one sentence. She read it as she ran it. The tight turn gave her information about the wide turn, and the wide turn gave her information about the exit. And the exit was where Cole was standing with his eyes closed and his awareness distributed across floor and air and pressure, and the composite picture assembling at a speed that 13 years of training had never asked of him before and 3 weeks of Ava Mercer had made available. He felt her coming. He felt the tight turn's energy signature carrying forward into the wide turn. He felt the wide turn converting that energy into a new vector. He felt the exit approach with a momentum signature that was genuinely continuous, no reset, no interruption. The corridor, one thing from entry to exit. He stepped. He was 1 beat late, not a full beat. The fraction that remained between where he was and where the system could eventually take him, the gap that 6 days of mission preparation would not fully close, but that 3 more months of the work Ava had built would. Mara's shoulder cleared the inside of his arm, and she was through. The corridor was empty. Cole opened his eyes. The platoon was completely still. Then Torres said, "Did she just beat Cole?" And Hackett said, "She beat the corridor. Cole just happened to be in it." Cole stood at the exit end and looked at his platoon and felt the particular quality of a moment that will be carried forward, not as a story to be told at bars, though it would be that too, but as a fact embedded in the body of every person who was present, a fact about what was possible when you stopped fighting your own momentum and started understanding it. He said, "Session closed." He walked to where Ava was standing. She looked at him and said nothing. He said, "Whatever happens in 6 days, this work goes with them, all of it." She said, "That's what it was built for." He said, "I know, but I want you to know I understand that now. Not as a training outcome, as a fact about what you built in 3 weeks with 12 people who didn't want to be taught anything." He paused, "Including me." Ava held his gaze. She said, "You were the hardest one." Cole said, "I know." She said, "You were also the reason the others came all the way through. When a commander inhabits the work instead of observing it, the platoon doesn't have a performance audience anymore. They have a partner. That changes everything." Cole looked at his platoon, at Briggs collecting his gear with the specific quietness of a man carrying something new and treating it carefully, at Hackett already running the mission geometry in his head, eyes unfocused internal, at Torres talking to Reyes with a focus that was different from his usual talking, purposeful, operational, at Mara Ellis standing at the exit end of the corridor, looking at the tape one last time, with an expression that Cole could now read clearly, and that said, without ambiguity, "I knew I was here all along." He said to Ava, "Will you be in the debrief after the mission?" She said, "If you want me there." He said, "I want you there." She nodded once. He said, "And after the debrief, I want to talk about building this into the standard pre-deployment curriculum, not as an elective, as doctrine." Ava looked at him for a long moment. He could see her running the calculation that was always running behind her eyes, assessing, measuring, determining whether the input was real or performed. She had been doing it for 3 weeks. She had been doing it since the first morning when she walked through the gate and read the yard before the gate finished swinging open. She said, "That conversation is worth having." Cole said, "It's more than worth having. It's necessary." She said, "Then we'll have it." Cole looked at the corridor one last time, the tape on the floor, the 2 turns, the 32 feet that had been a different 32 feet 3 weeks ago, that had held a different geometry before Ava Mercer walked through a gate and into the laughter of 12 people who had already decided what she was. He thought about what she had said on the very first morning, standing in front of a yard full of dismissal with a folder in her hand and 12 operators who weren't looking at her the right way. "I'm here because I understand something about how force works that your current training doesn't address." She had been right. She had been exactly right. And Cole Maddox, who had built his career on knowing things with certainty, had spent 3 weeks learning what it meant to understand something rather than simply know it. And the difference between those two things was the difference between a corridor that killed you and a corridor that carried you through. His platoon walked out of the yard and into a mission that was 6 days away, carrying a system in their bodies that had not existed in that yard 22 days ago. They carried it not as information, but as instinct, not as knowledge, but as capacity, not as something they had been taught, but as something they had become. And that the becoming was the only thing that would matter when the corridor was real and the noise was real and the instinct was firing on everything it had, and the choice between power and understanding was made in the fraction of a second that separated a predictable pattern from an operator who could not be read. The yard was empty. The tape was still on the floor. And somewhere in the geometry of those 32 feet, in the 2 turns, in the exit, in the principle that lived in every inch of it, Ava Mercer had left something that would outlast the 3 weeks, outlast the mission, outlast the after-action report, in the debrief, in the conversation about doctrine. She had left the truth that the most dangerous force in any corridor is not the one coming toward you. It is the one you carry inside yourself without knowing its name. Cole Maddox's platoon knew its name now. That made them something they had never been before, Not stronger, not faster, not more experienced, but something more essential than any of those things. Ready.